The neon lights of the casino pulsed against the dark night sky like a giant, glowing heartbeat. It was a rhythmic, artificial throb that cut through the silence of the city, pulling the gaze of every passerby toward a fortune that felt almost within reach. The light spilled across the asphalt, turning the pavement into a shimmering, electric mirror. Below the glow, the air carried a faint, metallic hum, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to rattle the teeth of anyone standing too close. This was a place built on the promise of sudden wealth, a siren song sung in vibrant neons and high-contrast shadows. Every flicker of the sign felt calculated, a hypnotic lure designed to strip away caution and replace it with the sharp, jagged edge of desire. Inside, the environment was a relentless symphony of sound and light. Rows of machines blinked in rapid, chaotic patterns. Dealers moved with mechanical, rhythmic precision, their hands blurring over green felt. The constant, melodic clinking of coins hitting metal trays filled the space, creating a dense, layered atmosphere where greed and hope fought for dominance. It was a landscape of infinite possibility, where the line between luck and loss was thinner than a breath, and the heavy, electric air waited, motionless, for someone to dare and play. Two figures emerged from the crowd, stopping dead at the base of the grand entrance. B planted his feet, staring up at the towering architecture. He shifted his weight, checked the perimeter, and flashed a grin that held more bravado than certainty. "Tonight is the night, Chips," he whispered, the sound barely audible over the hum of the exterior lights. "We are going to hit the jackpot." He adjusted his position, eyes scanning the golden facade as if measuring the strength of a fortress wall. Beside him, Chips mirrored the stance but kept his focus on the shifting shadows near the doorway. He let out a dry, rhythmic laugh that cut through the tension. "Or we lose $20 and end up blaming the slot machines for our bad luck," he countered, his tone light but eyes wary. They stood shoulder to shoulder, framed by the blinding shimmer of the light. B reached out, tracing the edge of the heavy, metallic frame of the door, testing its resistance. He looked at Chips, who nodded once, a silent agreement to proceed. The hesitation vanished, replaced by a shared, reckless momentum. They shifted their weight forward in unison, hands reaching out to grip the cold, solid surface of the entrance, ready to step into the heart of the machine. The heavy golden doors swung inward with a pressurized hiss, surrendering to their combined weight. As they crossed the threshold, the world outside simply ceased to exist. A wall of sound hit them, a chaotic, layered roar of bells, electronic chirps, and the relentless, rhythmic clinking of falling coins. It was like walking into the center of a mechanical storm. The air was thick, charged with a strange, static energy that prickled against their skin. Everywhere they looked, neon colors bled into one another, creating a blur of electric blue, stinging magenta, and blinding gold. Rows of slot machines stretched toward a horizon that seemed to vanish into the rafters. Each screen flickered in a desperate, rapid-fire sequence, demanding attention. Dealers stood like statues behind long, green felt tables, their movements sharp and practiced, shuffling decks with a speed that defied the eye. B took a step forward, his boot clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Chips followed, his gaze darting between the spinning reels and the shifting crowds. The sheer volume of the place made conversation impossible. They moved deeper into the labyrinth of light, drawn forward by the magnetic pull of the machines, stepping further into the heart of the symphony. The noise of the main floor began to dull, replaced by an eerie, muffled stillness as they drifted toward the back of the hall. The bright, pulsating colors gave way to deep, stretching shadows. B pushed aside a heavy velvet curtain, revealing a narrow aisle tucked away from the rest of the room. Here, the air felt cooler, stagnant, as if the ventilation of the casino refused to reach this corner. B stopped abruptly, his hand coming to rest on a cold metallic surface. It was a single, ancient slot machine standing apart from the rows of modern, glowing consoles. Its casing was covered in a thin layer of gray dust that seemed to absorb the dim light. B wiped a patch clear, his fingers leaving streaks against the grime. The screen flickered with a life of its own, casting a pale, sickly light onto the floor. The reels were frozen, displaying 2 sevens and a single, glowing question mark that pulsed in rhythm with something unseen. B leaned in, his breath hitching as he stared at the display. The machine did not hum like the others. It sat in a heavy, expectant silence. He turned to look at Chips, his expression sharpening, realizing that this specific device was completely disconnected from the rest of the casino's manic energy. Chips drifted closer, drawn by the strange light radiating from the screen, and he reached out to steady himself against the machine, his hand hovering inches from the base before he saw the dark, metallic plaque bolted to the front. The edges were jagged, rusted into the frame as if it had been there for centuries. He squinted to make out the words etched into the cold surface. "The house always wins," he read aloud. The words seemed to hang in the stagnant air between them. He let out a sharp, forced laugh that echoed too loudly in the narrow aisle. "Well, that is not exactly the kind of encouragement I was looking for tonight," he joked, but his eyes stayed fixed on the inscription. He shifted his weight, taking a half step back, his boots scuffing the floor. The joke fell flat, swallowed by the silence surrounding the machine. B did not answer. He remained locked in place, his focus entirely on the flickering question mark on the screen. The machine felt solid, immovable, and entirely indifferent to their presence. Chips looked at the reels, then back at the plaque, the weight of the warning settling into the space between them. The air grew colder, the scent of ozone and old dust thickening as they stood before the machine, trapped in the quiet gravity of the moment. B reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against a single silver coin, its edges worn smooth, cold enough to sting his skin. He pulled it out, holding it up to the dim light. It shimmered, catching the flicker from the slot machine screen. And for a second, the metal felt heavy, as if it were pulling his hand toward the floor. Chips watched, his silence absolute, his gaze fixed on the narrow mattock of the machine. And he stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He did not hesitate. He slid the coin into the slot. The machine accepted the metal with a sharp, metallic click that sounded like a jaw snapping shut. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then, a deep, grinding sound vibrated through the metal casing, a low-frequency rumble that started in the very guts of the machine. It was a mechanical groan, long and resonant, like a beast waking from a centuries-long sleep. The internal gears began to catch and turn, metal scraping against metal with a rhythmic, hungry precision. The screen flared, the question mark vanishing as the reels twitched in their housing. The machine had been fed, and now it was beginning to hunt. The reels accelerated. They moved with such velocity that the symbols vanished, replaced by a blurred, shimmering streak of color. The mechanical hum intensified, climbing into a high-pitched whine that set the teeth on edge. Then, the floor beneath their boots reacted. A tremor rippled through the foundation of the room, sharp and jarring. B stumbled, his heels skidding on the polished surface as the vibrations traveled up through his legs. Chips grabbed the edge of the machine to steady himself, but the metal casing was shaking so violently that it rattled his bones. The floor was no longer solid. It felt like the deck of a ship in a storm. The sound of shifting gears grew into a thunderous roar, drowning out the ambient noise of the casino hall. They tried to step back, but the rhythm of the shaking threw them off balance, pinning them in place before the machine. Dust fell from the ceiling in thin gray curtains. The air pressure in the aisle plummeted, pulling the breath from their lungs. Every surface in the hall began to hum in sympathy with the machine. They were caught in a tectonic shift, the floor beneath them undulating with a power that defied the architecture of the building, reaching a crescendo that left them no path of escape. The roar reached a pitch that felt physical, a wall of sound pressing against their chests. Then, without warning, the motion ceased. The reels slammed into place with the sound of a heavy vault door locking shut. Silence flooded the aisle, absolute and thick, instantly replacing the mechanical screech. B and Chip stood frozen, their lungs burning, eyes locked on the machine. The three reels displayed glowing question marks. Pulsing with a rhythmic, sickly cadence, the metal casing began to buckle. A hairline fracture appeared in the center of the screen, bleeding a sharp, neon green brilliance. The light did not shine. It spilled out like liquid, thick and hungry. It hit the floor and ignited the air. Within a fraction of a second, The emerald glow expanded, turning from a flicker into a blinding, torrential blast. It swallowed the walls, the carpet, and the shadows of the casino. B threw his hands up, but the light passed through his skin, cold and jarring. Chips reached out, his fingers clawing at the empty air, but the brilliance had already erased the floor beneath them. Everything familiar dissolved into a singular, suffocating wave of green fire, leaving them suspended in a void that erased the world. Gravity ceased to exist. B and Chips were no longer standing, they were falling through a tunnel of impossible light. The emerald void shattered into millions of shards, each reflecting a warped version of the casino floor. Then, the debris arrived. Thousands of playing cards, sharp as razors, whipped past their faces in a torrential gale. They dodged, but the cards moved with a predatory intent, carving thin lines into the air. Roulette wheels, massive and spinning with rhythmic clicks, tumbled through the space like runaway gears, forcing them to twist and contort to avoid impact. The sound was a cacophony of clinking coins and the frantic shuffle of decks, amplified to a deafening roar. Chips reached out to grab B, but his hand passed through a stream of golden chips that felt like liquid cold. They were spinning, their bodies tumbling in the wake of the vortex. The world outside the machine, the casino, their own memories of the street, it all thinned into nothingness. Everything turned into a kaleidoscope of red, black, and gold, dragging them deeper into the center of the storm. They were no longer in control of their own limbs, pulled by a current that tasted of ozone and old, metallic dust. The vortex tightened its grip, pulling them toward a central, swirling eye of pure, blinding light. The descent ended with a bone-jarring impact. B slammed into a surface that felt like hard, unyielding plastic. He groaned, the sound swallowed by a vast, hollow space. His head throbbed, a sharp, rhythmic pulse that matched the fading echo of the vortex. He reached out, his palms scraping against a cold, smooth edge. He was not on carpet. He was on a mountain of oversized synthetic chips. He pushed himself upright, his movements sluggish and heavy. Every breath tasted of stale dust and ozone. A few feet away, a pile of chips shifted. Chips groaned, rolling onto his side, his face etched with confusion. He pressed his palms into the mound, trying to find purchase, but the plastic discs slid beneath him like loose shale. B scrambled toward him, hands clawing at the giant, rigid tokens. They were larger than dinner plates, molded from a material that felt more like stone than polymer. B looked up, but there was no ceiling. There was only a dim, oppressive haze that stretched into an impossible distance. He helped Chips to his feet, but they both stumbled as the ground beneath them swayed. They were trapped in a graveyard of game pieces, and the silence here was heavier than the air itself. B gripped the edge of a giant chip to steady himself as the ground settled. He scanned the distance, his eyes tracing a line that refused to resolve into a normal horizon. Endless rows of slot machines marched toward the edge of sight, standing like silent, monolithic sentinels in a barren wasteland. The air above them was crowded with massive, luminous shapes. Jackpot signs, tall as city buildings, drifted through the hazy sky like glowing, predatory clouds. They pulsed with a rhythmic golden light that cast long, flickering shadows across the dunes of poker chips. Chips walked to the edge of the mound, staring out at the expanse. He pointed toward a cluster of distant lights that flickered with a cold, mechanical intensity. There were no trees, no roads, and no sky, only the relentless architecture of a game that had no end. B climbed higher, reaching the peak of the chip pile to get a better vantage point. His jaw tightened as he realized the pattern. Every direction he looked, the landscape repeated the same metallic geometry. It was a desert of machines, a horizon built entirely of levers, reels, and flashing displays. They were not just in a room. They were in an entire world constructed from the very game they had tried to beat. A deep, resonant thrumming began to vibrate through the soles of their feet. It started as a faint tremor in the ground and quickly escalated into a rhythmic, metallic pounding that echoed across the dunes. B dropped to a crouch, pressing his ear to the cold surface of a giant chip. The sound was not natural. It was the synchronized grinding of heavy gears and iron pistons. From behind a towering ridge of slot machines, a massive shape emerged. Then another, and another. Hundreds of giant mechanical constructs materialized from the haze. Their bodies were composed of rusted levers, exposed copper wiring, and heavy brass plating. They moved with a predatory, stiff-limbed gait, kicking up clouds of metallic dust. Each machine possessed a single burning red lens that swept the horizon in wide, calculated arcs. As the lead machine closed the distance, its central screen flickered to life. A harsh, electronic voice boomed across the desert, vibrating the very air around them. It flashed a single, terrifying command: insert coin. The cousins backed away, but the machines shifted their formation, effectively cutting off any path of retreat. There was no room left to run, and the machines were closing in with a relentless, mechanical hunger. The machines loomed, their gears clicking in a deafening, rhythmic chorus of intent. There was no path left. No cover remained. B felt the heat radiating from the approaching metal giants, the air thick with the smell of ozone and burnt oil. He scrambled backward, his heel striking something hard and cold embedded in the chip dunes. He looked down. A massive, oversized casino token lay half-buried in the debris. It pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow that matched the red eyes of the advancing monsters. B did not hesitate. He lunged, fingers locking around the heavy metal edge. The moment he gripped it, the token shuddered. It expanded with a violent metallic snap, stretching and hardening in his palm. The surface shimmered, turning from dull brass to a gleaming, translucent edge. In a blink, the token was gone, replaced by a razor-sharp sword that hummed with a low, vibrating energy. B felt a sudden, sharp surge of cold adrenaline replace the panic in his veins. He swung the blade through the air, the steel singing as it sliced through the stagnant atmosphere. He was no longer just a target. He shifted his weight, gripped the hilt with both hands, and turned to face the oncoming wall of iron. Chips watched B, his eyes widening as the blade caught the harsh red light of the approaching machines. He scrambled to his knees, clawing at the loose pile of poker chips beneath him. He grabbed a handful, intending to use them as a desperate barrier, but the moment his fingers tightened, the plastic grew dense and cold. He felt the edges sharpen, biting into his skin with a metallic edge. He pulled his hand back, and the chips were no longer plastic. They were thin, circular blades of polished silver, glowing with the same internal light as the sword. He flicked his wrist, and one disc spun through the air, carving a clean, whistling arc before embedding itself deep into a nearby gear. The impact was precise. He looked at his hand, then at the wall of iron machines closing in. A grin spread across his face, replacing the terror of a moment ago. He gathered more discs, stacking them against his forearm, feeling their weight and balance. They were heavy, lethal, and ready. Beside him, B adjusted his grip on the sword. They stood together, no longer cowering in the dust, but anchored by the sudden, impossible reality that they possessed the means to fight back. The mechanical roar of the beasts intensified, but for the first time, the sound did not signal their end. The first slot beast lunged, a massive lever arm swinging down like a falling tree. B pivoted, the sword trailing a line of light as he met the blow mid-air. Metal shrieked against metal, a shower of white-hot sparks erupting between them. He forced the beast's arm aside, stepped into the gap, and drove his blade into its central gear housing. The machine shuddered, groaned, and collapsed into a heap of twisted springs. Behind him, chips moved with fluid, lethal rhythm. He launched a silver disc, the weapon whistling through the air to sever a hydraulic line on a second approaching machine. Oil sprayed, glowing neon green in the darkness. The creature buckled, its red eyes flickering as it lost balance. A third beast surged forward, its chest cavity opening to reveal rotating tumblers. Chips didn't hesitate. He fired a volley of 3 discs, each one finding a target, jamming the internal gears and causing the machine to lock up in a violent, screeching halt. B and Chips fought back to back, their movements synchronized by the sheer necessity of the moment. They were faster than the gears, sharper than the steel. Every strike sent a cascade of sparks into the dust. As the last of the frontline machines fell, the roar of the desert went silent for a single, breathless heartbeat. They stood in the center of the wreckage, chests heaving, as the remaining giants hesitated in their advance. The remaining machines parted, rolling back into the dust to clear the horizon. From the shadows emerged the penny slot overlord, a towering structure of brass and iron, 3 stories of shifting gears and pulsing red light. It stopped, its central display spinning with a low, mechanical hum that vibrated through the ground. Suddenly, the front panel slid open. Thousands of oversized coins ejected with the force of cannon fire, creating a lethal, shimmering cloud that swept across the dunes. Bee and Chips dove behind the mangled remains of a fallen beast, the metal plating ringing out like a bell under the relentless hail of heavy, spinning currency. Chips pressed his back against the cooling steel, his hands tight around his remaining discs. Every time he tried to peek, a coin whistled past, carving a deep furrow into the earth inches from his face. The Overlord did not pause. It adjusted its aim, the sound of grinding metal echoing across the desert as it tracked their position. B gripped his sword, watching the gaps in the coin storm, but the frequency was too high, the spread too wide. They were trapped in a corner of the wreckage, the air thick with the metallic scent of friction and the constant, deafening clatter of gold hitting iron. They had no clear path forward. The defensive struggle became a test of endurance as the machine accelerated its fire. The coin storm stuttered. For a fraction of a second, the Overlord's internal gears ground against each other, jamming the feed. B saw the shift in the machine's posture. He looked at Chips, who immediately launched a barrage of silver discs, striking the machine's sensors to create a distraction. B sprinted from the wreckage, boots sinking into the loose sand as he closed the distance. He leaped, catching a protruding lever on the machine's lower flank. The Overlord lurched, its metal limbs flailing to shake him off. B ignored the vibration, pulling himself up past rotating tumblers and hot exhaust vents. He found his footing on a spinning gear, then lunged upward toward the central reel. The machine let out a high-pitched, metallic shriek as it detected his presence. A heavy arm swung toward him, but B ducked, bracing his legs against the brass casing. With a roar of effort, he drove the razor-sharp sword deep into the glowing heart of the central reel. The metal buckled under the strike. A crack of blinding light pulsed from the point of impact. The entire machine groaned, its gears locking into place, before it exploded in a blinding shower of gold and shrapnel. The rain of gold chips and twisted metal finally ceased, leaving the desert silent once more. B tumbled backward from the wreckage, sliding through the cooling sand until he came to a stop beside Chips. Both men lay still, chests heaving, their lungs burning from the acrid smoke of the detonation. The Overlord was gone, replaced by a crater of jagged, smoking iron that stretched wide across the dunes. Chips pushed himself up, wiping grit from his face, and gestured toward the horizon. Above the settling dust, the sky began to bleed a brilliant, shimmering amber. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the ground, not with the harshness of a machine, but with a melodic, rhythmic pulse. Slowly, the air itself began to solidify into translucent, golden steps. They materialized in a perfect, arching line, beginning at the edge of the crater and ascending into the clouds above. Each step glowed with a steady, inviting warmth, defying the laws of gravity as they hovered motionless against the vast, empty sky. B stood up, his sword still gripped in his hand, and watched as the staircase stretched further, disappearing into the swirling mists of the upper atmosphere. There was no path back. The only way to move was up. He looked at Chips, who nodded, and they stepped toward the first rising platform. The golden staircase held firm under their weight, carrying them through a thick, swirling mist that tasted faintly of ozone and old paper. As they reached the final step, the light abruptly snapped off, dropping them onto a flat, velvet-textured expanse that stretched for miles. B stumbled, his boots sinking slightly into a surface that felt like industrial-grade felt. The sky above was no longer empty. It was dominated by massive, hovering suits of cards that drifted like heavy, silent clouds. Before them lay an endless grid of giant tables, their surfaces polished to a mirror finish. Towering pillars made of stacked deck boxes rose into the distance, casting long, sharp shadows across the landscape. The ground itself was patterned in a repeating, dizzying array of red hearts and black spades, each one the size of a city block. Chips reached out to touch the side of a nearby structure, finding it cold and slick to the touch, like high-gloss plastic. The silence here was heavy, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic shuffling of massive, unseen decks deep beneath the floor. They walked forward, their footsteps echoing against the strange, synthetic ground. The air grew tense, vibrating with the static charge of a game about to begin. They were no longer in the desert. They had entered the heart of the deck. The silence shattered. From behind the towering pillars of deck boxes, rows of soldiers emerged. They were flat, rigid figures, each bearing the jagged edges of a heart or a spade. They moved in perfect unison, their edges gleaming like polished steel. B drew his blade, the metal humming as it caught the ambient light. Chips gripped his throwing discs, his eyes scanning the advancing line. The soldiers lunged, their movements sharp and geometric. B ducked a sweeping strike, his blade creating a clean arc that sheared through the center of a spade soldier, sending it crumbling into a pile of paper confetti. Beside him, Chip stepped into the fray, launching a disc that ricocheted between 3 heart soldiers, toppling them in a single fluid motion. The enemies adjusted instantly, closing the gaps and forcing the cousins into a tight circle. B pivoted, locking his back against Chip's, and they fought as one. Every strike B landed opened a lane for Chips to follow through. They moved with a rhythm that felt instinctual, their weapons glowing brighter with every successful hit. The soldiers fell in waves, their ranks thinning as the cousins pushed forward. The ground was littered with fragments of cards, yet more kept spawning from the shadows. With a final, coordinated flurry, they cut through the last of the line, leaving the path ahead clear of the immediate threat. The paper soldiers dissolved into dust, leaving the cousins standing in the wake of the battle. B wiped his blade on the ground, the metal ringing once before, settling into a dull hum. They turned their backs on the scattered ruins and began to walk toward the horizon. The landscape shifted under their feet. The velvet floor hardened, turning into polished obsidian that reflected the dim, flickering lights above. Ahead, the card table kingdom gave way to a massive, looming structure that blocked out the sky. It was the High Roller Citadel. Walls of solid, reinforced steel rose hundreds of feet, etched with glowing, geometric patterns that pulsed in sync with a low, sub-bass thrumming. The temperature dropped abruptly, turning their breath into visible plumes of mist. B stopped, his boots clicking sharply against the cold floor. The air felt thin and charged with static. Every step they took toward the massive, arched entrance echoed with the weight of an impending finality. There were no more minions here, no more swarms to fight, only the long, silent corridor leading into the heart of the fortress. They stood at the base of the gate, looking up as the massive doors began to grind open, revealing a darkness that seemed to swallow the light. They walked into the hall, the sound of their boots muffled by the vast emptiness. The ceiling vanished into shadow, but the center of the room was illuminated by a sickly, pulsing emerald glow. There, resting on a dais made of stacked, razor-sharp black cards, sat the Blackjack King. He did not move, yet the air around him seemed to warp and ripple with raw, ancient pressure. The cards forming his seat shifted, clicking and sliding against each other like the teeth of a predator. B kept his hand on his sword, the blade vibrating in anticipation of the coming strike. Beside him, Chip stood still, his fingers hovering over the throwing discs at his side. The king stared at them, his eyes 2 burning pits of cold, green fire that seemed to pierce through their very intent. He did not speak, but the weight of his presence made the floor beneath them shudder. Every shadow in the room detached from the walls, creeping forward as if to seal the exit behind them. The cousins were no longer hunters. They were prey, walking into a locked cage. The king leaned forward, the black cards of his throne groaning under the movement, and the temperature in the hall plummeted until frost began to bloom across the floor. The game had reached its absolute limit. The king roared, a sound like grinding metal, and slammed his fist against the dais. The room did not just shake, it shattered. Walls, ceiling, and floor disintegrated into millions of individual playing cards that spiraled outward into a vast, star-strewn void. B and Chips were tossed into the air, gravity failing them for a heartbeat as they plummeted through the darkness. The floor beneath them had vanished. They scrambled, catching at the empty air, until a sudden jarring thud threw them onto a solid surface. They were standing on a colossal card table that floated silently in the deep, cold vacuum of space. Above them, the stars were distorted, stretched into long, needle-thin lines of light. Below, there was only an endless drop into nothingness. The king loomed on the opposite side of the table, his presence anchoring this impossible platform. There were no walls, no exits, and no shadows to hide in. The table itself was immense, its felt surface cold to the touch and slick as ice. Every movement they made caused the entire arena to tilt and shudder in the dark. They were entirely exposed, pinned to a stage that offered no shelter, drifting through the heart of the realm's madness. The void pressed in, a suffocating weight that threatened to extinguish their resolve. The king stood motionless, a silhouette of malice against the distant, distorted stars. B felt the air grow heavy, the cold of the vacuum seeping through his skin. He looked at Chips, who gripped his throwing discs until his knuckles turned white. In that shared glance, a pulse of warmth ignited between them, defying the freezing emptiness. B's sword began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that traveled up his arm and settled into his chest. The blade flickered, then flared with a steady, brilliant white light. Chip's discs responded, shedding their dull finish to pulse with a matching, rhythmic glow. The light spilled outward, carving a circle of safety into the oppressive dark. The king hissed, his emerald eyes narrowing as he recoiled from the sudden radiance. The darkness surged forward, a tidal wave of shadows trying to choke the glow, but the cousins held their ground. They anchored themselves to the floating table, their spirits synced. The weapons burned brighter, casting long, sharp shadows across the surface. They were no longer from the abyss, Ken, or the source of the only light in the universe. The king braced himself, sensing the shift in momentum. The final assault began with a simultaneous sprint across the slick, cold surface of the floating table. B led, his white-hot blade carving a path through the swirling shadows, while Chips sprinted at his flank, discs spinning like twin saws. The king roared, weaving his hands through the air, and a wall of black cards erupted from the void to bar their way. B did not slow. He struck the barrier, his sword biting into the card mass with a screech of tearing metal. Sparks showered the void. Chips leaped onto B's back, vaulting off his shoulders to clear the obstruction. The king lunged, his emerald fire flaring to incinerate them, but the cousins moved as one. B lunged forward, driving his across into the king's guard, pinning the dark energy in place. Chips threw his discs in a perfect, intersecting arc. They slammed into the crown with the force of a thunderclap. The black metal shrieked as it split. A blinding, crystalline fracture spiderwebbed across the king's headgear. With one final, coordinated push, they drove their weapons home. The crown disintegrated into harmless gray ash. The source of the realm's dark magic vanished, leaving only a deafening, hollow silence in the vacuum. The silence shattered. A deep, tectonic groan vibrated through the foundation of the citadel. Beneath their feet, the black surface splintered, spiderwebbing outward from where the crown had fallen. The floating table tilted violently, sending shards of obsidian cascading into the abyss below. B grabbed the edge of a jagged slab, his knuckles straining as the floor beneath him disintegrated into floating dust. Chips slid toward the crumbling perimeter, his fingers clawing at the slick surface until he caught a protruding lever. The entire architecture of the room began to fold inward like a collapsing house of cards. Massive pillars snapped, their marble fragments drifting into the void, weightless and chaotic. Emerald fire, no longer contained by the king, leaked from the cracks in the sky, searing the edges of reality. The cousins scrambled upward, leaping across platforms that were already vanishing into thin air. Every step required a frantic calculation of physics as the ground shifted and tilted beneath their weight. The air filled with the roar of 1,000 gears grinding to a halt. Reality was unspooling, and the space between the platforms widened into an impassable chasm. They had to move, and they had to move now, before the very ground they stood upon dissolved into nothingness. The final platform shuddered, dropping away into the dark expanse. B and Chip stood at the absolute edge, the only solid ground left in a world that had forgotten how to exist. Ahead, the air itself began to scream. A jagged, blinding fissure tore through the center of the void, pulsing with a raw, white light that defied the gloom of the casino realm. It was the exit, but the fissure was shrinking, the edges curling inward like burning paper. B looked at Chips, then toward the light. "Jump!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the thunder of the collapsing architecture. They sprinted. The floor beneath them vanished as they pushed off, leaving them suspended for a heartbeat in the open air. Behind them, the citadel folded into a single blinding point of heat and light. They dove into the center of the rift, arms outstretched, fingers clawing at the shimmering boundary. The world turned to liquid silver. A sudden, violent pressure crushed against them, slamming them forward. They were no longer running. They were falling through a tunnel of spinning light and sound. The mechanical roar of the realm faded into a high-pitched whine, then snapped into absolute silence. Gravity returned with a brutal, sudden impact. The impact knocked the breath from their lungs. They hit the patterned carpet hard, limbs splayed, sliding several feet until they collided with the base of a row of slot machines. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of their own ragged breathing and the faint, rhythmic hum of the building's air conditioning. B blinked, his vision swimming with afterimages of emerald fire and gold. He pushed himself up, his palms pressing against the familiar, slightly tacky texture of the floor. Across from him, Chips remained still, staring up at the ceiling as if waiting for the sky to tear open again. The casino was exactly as they had left it. The same rows of flashing lights, the same distant clatter of coins, the same indifferent atmosphere. The silence felt heavy, pressing down on them with a weight that was almost suffocating after the constant roar of the realm. B reached out, gripping the edge of the nearest machine to steady his shaking hands. The metal was cold, solid, and stubbornly real. He looked at the machine in the corner, then back at Chips. The world had not ended, yet the air felt thin, charged with the lingering, impossible memory of the battle they had just survived. B found his footing, his knees trembling as he stood. He reached down and pulled Chips to his feet, their hands gripping each other with a sudden, sharp intensity. They did not speak. The words felt too small, too fragile to carry the weight of what they had just escaped. They turned toward the corner where the ancient slot machine sat, its surface dull and lifeless under the artificial glow of the overhead lights. It looked ordinary. It looked harmless. That was the most terrifying part. B took a step toward it, his hand twitching, then stopped. He shook his head, a single, firm motion of refusal. Chips followed his gaze, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the empty slot where the coin had vanished. They turned their backs on the machine, leaving the silence of the corner behind. They walked through the aisles, past rows of blinking lights and the rhythmic chime of winning players, moving with a deliberate, steady pace toward the exit. Every step felt like putting more distance between their current lives and the impossible, jagged edges of the realm they had barely survived. They reached the heavy doors, pushed them open, and stepped out into the cool, dark night air, finally leaving the nightmare in the shadows of the floor. Inside the quiet corner, the abandoned machine sat in total stillness. Then, the glass screen began to pulse. A faint, low-frequency hum vibrated through the metal casing, barely audible against the ambient noise of the casino. The reels jerked once, then twice, before the internal lights flared with a sharp, dying intensity. Across the darkened glass, letters began to crawl in a jagged, flickering script. They spelled out, "Thank you for playing," before the entire device dissolved into a fine, swirling mist of silver dust. The dust hit the carpet and vanished as if it had never existed. High above, hidden in the shadows of the vaulted ceiling, a pair of eyes caught the dim light. A mouth curved into a slow, deliberate expression of triumph. The game had not ended. It had merely been reset. The stakes remained set. The board was clear, and the house was already waiting for the next player to drop a coin. The hum faded into the distance, leaving behind only the cold, lingering certainty that the door to the realm was never truly locked.